Hi, my name is Karen Baglieri. I am part of the Sisterhood of Hope's Garden. And here at Hope's Garden, we like to tape and record witnesses of testimonies from different people who are part of our group that will give people hope in the world today and in the struggles of life. And today I'm talking with Betsy Leon, and Betsy has gone through a pretty serious trial with the loss of one of her children, and she's here to talk about how God walked with her through that trial, and in the end, how God is still walking with her in that trial. So Betsy, welcome today.
Hi,
and I'm just going to ask you to just launch into your story.
Sure. Okay, so in May of 2017, my husband and I had been married at that time for almost 5 years. It was second marriage for both of us, and we have 9 children between us. And I found out I was pregnant. And I was 45, and it was a little, not crazy out of the blue, but was not what we were expecting, and we were thrilled. But as that summer of being pregnant progressed, the early prenatal testing, which we did because of my age, revealed that our son had what we call, in the medical community, they call it incompatible with life. His diagnosis was for trisomy 18. And most trisomy 18 babies do not make it to even be born alive. So this was a really devastating diagnosis. We were so excited and thrilled to welcome another child, our first together, and we were just devastated to find out that there was an 87.7 chance that he had this condition. We did not do the only medical test that would have confirmed it, which would be an amniocentesis. We did not do that because there's inherently a risk to the baby in the womb. So as my pregnancy progressed, we were left with a very strong possibility, but not a definitive diagnosis. And that was such a challenging place to be for the full 36 weeks of pregnancy that we were able to carry our son. Because by virtue of the fact that we didn't know for sure, we lived completely in the land of uncertainty. Very likely our son had this condition, and if so, he could either die in the womb, he could be born still, he could be born alive and die within minutes or hours or days. The percentage of trisomy 18 babies that when they're born alive that make it to their first birthday is about 5%. So the odds were completely against us. But we still had this much of a statistical probability that he was fine. So we lived in that land of uncertainty. And I'm so grateful that we didn't know for sure, because it allowed for complete hope. It allowed for trust. It allowed for possibility. I mean, absolutely, God could work a miracle even with a definitive diagnosis. But I learned so much from the Lord about walking in uncertainty, because we were presented with a situation that was completely out of our control. And all of the things I wanted to do to fix it, change it, went against my values. I mean, yes, it's not a sin to do the amniocentesis, but we didn't feel comfortable doing it. It was such a miracle that I was pregnant at 45. I never expected that. And we didn't want to put our son at any risk. So the uncertainty was such a path of total surrender, because there's nothing you can do except wait and pray and see how the story's going to unfold. How will our son and his life unfold in God's plan? So that was such an opportunity for spiritual growth. We leaned really heavily on our faith community. We put out blasts of emails, just knowing that we couldn't do this on our own. We named our son early in the process. We received the the 87.7% chance diagnosis in August of 2017, and I was about 10 weeks pregnant. And normally I would never have shared a name for my child at that point, but Ralph and I, my husband Ralph and I, got together and we just said, we need to name this baby so that everyone can pray for him very directly by name. And I really wanted Ralph to choose the name. So his name is John Paul Raphael, but he's actually not named after Pope St. John Paul. So his first name is John, because I was 45, but Ralph was even older. So he really just felt this inspiration from Zechariah, the elderly Zechariah and Elizabeth, who had John the Baptist very late in life. So his first name is John, after John the Baptist. And then my husband went through a very profound personal conversion in the years before we were married. So he relates very strongly to St. Paul, the apostle.
Sure.
So John Paul. And then I added the Raphael because, first of all, my husband is Cuban and speaks fluent Spanish, and his name is Ralph. But in Spanish, that would be Raphael. But also, the Archangel Raphael's name means God heals.
Right, right.
So we just wanted all the all the help we could get for one little tiny baby, John Paul Raphael.
Right. As you said, you leaned into your community. And I think that's really important so people don't isolate themselves in trials, that you leaned into help from other people. Could you just talk about that a little bit and how that helped you?
Sure. Yeah, so we were really blessed. We had come together as a husband and wife after enduring death and divorce individually. So we really had some experience already with how to build a community of people in our church that will just hold you up when you can't hold yourself. And I'm convinced that it was our vulnerability and our willingness to step forward and say, we need help. We needed our community. We told anybody we could think of, and we told them to tell anybody they could think of that this little boy needed us to pray for him, and that we as a family needed God's grace and strength to just pour on us, because getting up every morning and surrendering is so hard. You know, our natural instincts are to grasp for something. You know, we felt like we lived for 36 weeks, like at the precipice of a cliff where at any moment we could be pushed off. And your instinct is to secure yourself. But it was very clear because we never considered termination. I mean, it was offered, of course, but we said no. And we are so thankful that our Catholic faith informed us of that choice. But it was never even a choice for John Paul. We were going to love and welcome our son in whatever capacity God allowed his life to unfold. But we were powerless to do anything about it. All we could do is just allow him to grow and hope that every day he would stay alive. So we reached out to our community. We put posts on Facebook. We emailed far and wide, took advantage of every prayer chain we could, really with that vulnerability of we cannot do this without God's grace, and we need you all to help us. And one thing that happened, of course, when you ask for help and you reach out is people responded. And I can remember getting those emails and seeing them in my inbox and getting phone calls and texts, and I could not even read them. The love and the outpouring was too much. So I just kept them all aside, and days when I was ready and I was really at our wit's end, we would stop and we would gather ourselves and we would read through them and we would just weep, because when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, literally, the Lord was so close, but so was fear. You know, we're told be not afraid. So spiritually we were not afraid, but humanly we were. There was no way to avoid that.
I think that's really an important point, because, you know, you and I had talked about the fact that, you know, you had pretty much accepted the limits of what your son's life was going to be, which is very important. That's that surrender piece and the acceptance piece. And then in reaching out to the other community on those days when you felt hopeless or down or depressed or just so sad, overwhelmed with sadness, they were giving you hope. When you may have dropped into that hopeless state.
Yeah.
And that's Christ being with us through
Mhm.
the church and through the community and through our friends.
Mhm.
This is how he works. He works through us.
Mhm.
There's the Bible verse, we are his hands and his feet. We're here to do his work. So that's very, very important. Why don't you fast forward now to your son's birth around the time when he was born?
Sure. So there was a long, complicated pregnancy, but every week we made another week. We were so thankful. John Paul was still here. Eventually, I was able to feel him moving. And one of the complications of trisomy 18 is the babies tend to be very small. Like, we had an expectation that if he made it full term, he would not be more than 4 pounds, probably.
Mhm.
And in fact, at birth, he was 4 pounds, 1 ounce.
Hey.
So we were happy he just tipped over the scales a little bit. But it was a very high risk situation. I had a condition called polyhydramnios, where one of the complications of trisomy 18 babies is they don't process the amniotic fluid well. So my belly was just 2 to 3 times the size you would expect.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I looked like I was carrying quadruplets,
Oh,
even
my.
though there was just one little tiny baby in there.
Mhm.
And so we knew that if my water were to break, it would be an emergency situation, because as the water comes out with such great force and volume, the placenta held against the uterus is what gives John Paul oxygen.
Mhm.
That if the water pulls out, the placenta often pulls out as well. And it's called a placental abruption.
Oh,
And when that happens, the baby is beginning to die already because they do not have an oxygen source. So it's almost always a cause of infant death. Well, we woke up on the morning of January 4th, 2018. My water broke, and it was big and it was sudden. Ralph had already left for work that day, and there was no school because it was super cold in Virginia. And my mind went blank. I didn't even know what to do. I had spent 36 weeks planning for this exact moment, and we had a plan with multiple doctors and hospitals and specialists. And I just called my kids. I called each of them by name. Come quickly, my water broke. And it was truly the first of dozens of, I can't say the first. The first was that John Paul was still alive.
Mhm.
Here we were 36 weeks later, and he was still alive.
Mhm.
So that was the biggest miracle. The next miracle was that my water broke just after 9 o'clock. We live in Northern Virginia. We're about 45 minutes outside of DC. Our hospital is 30 minutes away, and we were still in the middle of rush hour.
Mhm.
Now, luckily, schools were closed, but the weather was bad, but it wasn't icy. So from the second that my water broke and the kids called Ralph and we got ourselves together until John Paul was born by emergency cesarean section in the hospital, 30 plus minutes away, was 70 minutes. I mean, it was fast.
Wow.
It was fast. We probably didn't even get to the hospital until 9:45, 10 of 10. And they were being a little nonchalant and just, okay, let's get your baby on a monitor. And I said, no, get the monitor on right away. And they couldn't find a heartbeat.
Oh.
And then when they did, his heart rate was about 40 beats per minute. And I said, that's gotta be wrong. That's wrong. That's too low. It's too low. And then Ralph was there with me and he said, no, honey, that's his heartbeat. So in fact, he was dying in my womb. But we managed to get him out very quickly. And at 10:33, he was laid on my chest. And as he came out of my womb, the pictures show a baby that is gray and he's not moving. He is completely floppy. His eyes are closed and he did not cry. And they laid him on my chest and Ralph was right with me. And there was so much joy. I mean, here he was, right? Every mother can relate to that. You wait so long to meet your baby. And then here he was. I didn't even process the fact that I thought he was dead. Like, he looked dead.
Mhm.
But they laid him on my chest and immediately, the team said, do you want us to take him? We said, no, just, again, that surrender, that if it was God's will that he had died in my womb, then it was God's will. So we just had that moment. And Ralph pulled out a bottle of holy water from Our Lady of Lourdes.
Mm.
And immediately in those first moments, he baptized him in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and I did right after him. And he breathed.
Oh,
and he cried.
miracle.
It was such a miracle.
He cried?
He cried. He opened his eyes and he whimpered and he breathed. And like, will we ever know? Was he dead and resurrected by the power of baptism? He might as well have been. When you look at the pictures from when he came out of my womb till 5 minutes later, they are night and day.
Oh my gosh.
So we were just had this incredible miracle.
Praise God. That's just awesome. I can't imagine the joy you two felt when that
Absolutely.
happened.
And the thing I remember most about that time is we lived in fear for 36 weeks. I battled fear every day. Mm-hmm. This uncertainty, the suffering, the surrender was so hard. And yet here we were. Like the thing we had been waiting and praying for was like right now. And it all vanished. There was no fear. There was no sense of, wait, how long will he live? What's going to happen now? There was none of that. It was simply this incredible grace poured on us. And again, I am sure our network, because as soon as I left for the hospital with Ralph, our kids were spreading the news. Mm-hmm. Our network was praying. We were just covered in grace. As his life was going to be what it was going to be.
I have to believe that room you were in was covered, just full of saints and angels and all of that. Oh, my whole heavenly host were there. I mean, really, I just have to believe that. One of the things you were talking about was that miracle that happened when he breathed after you baptized him. Mm-hmm. And in our previous conversation, one of your quotes was that the miracle we get is not always what we pray for. So I bet never in a million years did you pray that something like that would happen. But indeed, that was the miracle that God gave you.
Well, in fact, I believe we did, because we said all along our prayer, like my dearest prayer, was just for him to be born alive.
Yeah.
And he was. He absolutely was. You know, our bigger prayer was that he not have trisomy 18 or that he'd be miraculously cured.
Right.
God was so faithful in really carrying us through and giving us the gift of his life. Well, we had part of the work we had done mm-hmm. was in being very clear with ourselves and with the medical community about the choices we were making for his life now.
Very important.
Because of course the medical team wanted to rush in. We could intubate him, we could take him to the NICU, we could do all that. And with trisomy 18, yes, would those things extend his life? They would. But ultimately, the way a baby will die, usually from trisomy 18, if they make it this far, is at some point, the brain just forgets to tell the body to breathe. Mm-hmm. And it's called apnea, I'm familiar with that word in adults as well. And you don't know when that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. I read countless stories. I was so over prepared for this experience, which I was grateful for, because in the moment we knew we did not want any extraordinary measures. We did not want him to be on a feeding tube. We did not want him to be on a ventilator, because that was not the life that God had shaped for him. We don't know why, but he had this condition, and we really wanted to love him within the limits of his condition. And that was important terminology for us, because the medical community says that babies like John Paul are incompatible with life. But he was alive all along. Like, even if he had died at 20 weeks, he was still alive for 20 weeks. Mm-hmm. So the better phrase that we embraced and that we share is a life-limiting diagnosis. And so we allowed his life to unfold within the limits that God allowed for it.
That's a very important distinction. That's mm-hmm. a very important distinction. Absolutely. It's a very pro-life distinction. Mm-hmm. Very pro-life distinction.
And the truth is, all of our lives are limited in some capacity.
Absolutely. We were on a previous Zoom call when we were on a retreat together. And during that call, you had explained an experience that you had with the crucifix. Mm-hmm. And Jesus on the crucifix. Would you share that with the people who are watching today?
Sure. So this vision is really the only, I don't love that word because it sounds really mystical and I am not, but it actually occurred in 2016. And at the time I was going through a pretty ugly custody battle for one of my other children with my ex-husband. And it was terrible. Everything about it was heartbreaking and terrible. And I was also at that time brought to my knees in just surrender. I had released the entire situation to Mary and was just trying to get through it and trust that God would work this for good. During that time, very spontaneously, I had an experience of Jesus inviting me to the cross. And he called me physically to Calvary, where I dragged a stepladder all the way over, and I was holding in my hand what looked like a bloody pile of flesh. And I knew instinctively that this was my wound. This was my fear, the thing that I was carrying. This was my terror for my son at that time. And I dragged my step ladder all the way over to the cross, and I propped it up, and I was looking up at Jesus on the cross and looking at my wounds and then seeing his wounds and just the enormity of what he did for us on the cross. And it wasn't that my pain didn't matter, but it was nothing in compared to what I saw there so vividly. And I heard Christ calling me to climb up on my ladder and hold on to him and to literally place my wounds and my sufferings directly into his side. And this was so vivid. I mean, the smell of his skin, the feel of the air, the wounds on his flesh. And I didn't want to do it because I knew I would hurt him. As I climbed the ladder, I had to hold on to him to not fall off. And every time I touched him, it hurt him more. And I saw my weakness and I saw my own sin. And I realized, of course, that this wound was not just what I was dealing with my son. It was everything I had ever done, everything I had ever, any way I'd ever hurt the Lord. But he just called me to come all the way up, and his eyes looking at me. And I climbed up there and just slid my hand directly into his sacred heart and left my wound there for him. And as I fast forwarding, as I was time for me to leave the cross, I still had this pile of bloody flesh in my hand, but it was Christ's wounds now that I was carrying with me. We exchanged them. I left what I carried with him, and then I carried his wounds back with me. I had no way of knowing how much going forward in my life, like the intimacy of that moment, the power and the connection and the closeness of Christ would, like, that strength was everything for how I was able to get through that suffering, some others that came along the way, and of course, ultimately the life and the death of our son just taught me to, in surrender, because there is no greater surrender than Christ on the cross.
Right.
Perfect love, perfectly surrendered. That's all we can do. So over and over again, I drag my ladder and I climb back up and I hold on to him and I just offer him whatever it is that I'm carrying. And he takes it from me, and I carry his pain back with me. And in this exchange, I am filled with grace and hope and peace to endure whatever his holy will may be for us.
That's one of the things, Betsy, that we always try to impart with people who come to us at Hope's Garden, is that suffering is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for spiritual growth. It's an opportunity to draw closer to the Lord. I know my own story. I ended up being very grateful for what I went through, because it completely transformed my spiritual life. It completely transformed my love of Jesus Christ. But that's it. We term it blooming in the darkness. And we are to bring our sufferings and putting them at the foot of the cross, with our Blessed Mother at our side, and just place those with Jesus and beg him to be part of this and to lead us and to be with us all the time. So what a beautiful story. That's good. That's going to sustain you for the rest of your life. And I'm sure that a lot of other people are going to benefit from that story. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, and you said something that has been so true for me, is that our sufferings, my sufferings, truly have been an invitation to joy. And when we try, we often have sufferings where we have some measure of control, decisions we can make or things that we can do. But when we yield to what God has laid out and we consent to it, even though we didn't choose it,
right?
That's when our softening, it is an invitation that we're responding to, because then we yield and he can just flood in. But when the times in my life where I have fought God's plan for me, and I fought my divorce for years and years and years. Even once I was happily remarried, I still fought it because it wreaked havoc in my life and was painful to my children. But only in truly yielding to that has God been able to finish his work, not finish, but continue his work in me. Because when we hold tight, there's no space for him. We have to open our hands so that he can flood in and heal us and use us as an instrument and fill us with joy. I mean, that's ultimately what happened, is that John Paul's death became an experience of joy because we accepted it as God willed it, not as we wanted it.
A total surrender, just as he did on the cross. Total surrender. Total surrender. Life has brought you some very difficult challenges. That's for sure. And it's such a beautiful thing when you can take that and share that to help other people. But I'm going to give you the opportunity right now. We've got a few minutes left. I'm going to give you a minute. And I want you to just kind of say, if you were to tell people one thing, the most important thing that you've learned through these trials and through the sufferings that you've had, and especially through the death of your son, what would you tell people?
I have the answer.
Great. Well, there you go.
Before I say it, though, I want to just wrap up that bit of the story, is that we were gifted with 1,690 minutes of total joy with our son. It was light and peace and love. And after 28 hours and 10 minutes, he passed away in our arms. The holiest and most beautiful and most painful experience of my whole life. But the night before we buried John Paul, I sat in the Adoration Chapel because my husband and I wanted to speak at his funeral. And we had no idea what to say. I had no idea what to say. And I just begged the Holy Spirit to come. He brought me two phrases, one of which we've already touched on, which is the miracle that you get is not always the miracle you pray for. And there have been countless miracles from John Paul's life, but one of them was not that he lived and stayed with us. We got the miracle of his life, 28 hours and 10 minutes of total love and joy. And we have a saint in heaven who intercedes for our family. And I trust, and some days I trust like this because it hurts so badly, but we trust that in God's plan, that was the way it needed to unfold. The second phrase that the Lord gave me that night truly has become my mission, which is to let yourself be loved. That's what I would say to any person in any uncertainty, any fear, any loss, any suffering that you're struggling with, is because our sufferings are an invitation from God. When you open yourself to that and you let him love you through the suffering, that changes everything, because it's yielding and receiving. It's the hardest and the easiest thing to do, because you actually don't have to do anything other than to accept in faith that the Lord is sovereign, that he loves you infinitely more than you can ever imagine, that his love is total and pure, that he can work miracles in your life that you don't even know about, but we have to receive it and we have to believe it. But when we do, that is where freedom and joy live. So let yourself be loved. That is John Paul's message, to let yourself be loved.
Why don't you show us his picture?
Here he is.
He is.
Here's John Paul Raphael.
There's a little angel on loan, as my husband would say.
Yeah.
Look at him with the little hat.
I know, the little hat. He didn't have to do anything to be loved. We adored him just because he was God's creation.
Sure.
And we need to receive that same gift of love.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, Betsy, thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
I am so grateful for your faith and for your story and your willingness to share that with people and to help other people. So thank you so much, and God bless you and your family.